Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum. I'm here today at Morphy's with a Chinese Type 50 submachine gun. This is a Chinese copy of the Russian PPSh-41, the Spagan, iconic submachine gun of the Second World War. And I'm really excited because we actually have the backstory on production of these guns. This specifically was made at Factory 626 in China, which you may think, I believe I've seen 626 on some Norinco AKs. And if you're thinking that, you would be right, because you did, because this is the same factory as that. Now, I have to give a big thanks to the author of the World War II After World War II blog, which unfortunately I believe is now defunct, but it's still online and has a tremendous amount of cool information, including some great details about the origins of Factory 626 and the origins of the Type 50 as well. So if you're not familiar with that blog, it's all about the proliferation of World War II small arms after the end of World War II, and they ended up in some really interesting, weird places. So I'll include a link in the description text. Check that blog out if you aren't familiar with it, and if you're interested in obscure, cool history. Now, on to our story here. This begins with the Mukden Arsenal. Well, it actually begins a couple decades before that. There's an arsenal set up in Manchuria, that is the area of China north of Beijing. It's in the far northeast of the country. Under the Chinese imperial system, there were a bunch of factories set up for small arms. This is one of them. In the 1930s, the Japanese just happened to kind of like wander into Manchuria, kind of like the Russians kind of wandering into Crimea in 2014. And they set themselves up there, and one of the things they do is take over this arsenal complex. It's a massive arsenal complex, by the way. They rename it the Mukden Arsenal, or they call it Mukden. It becomes known as the Mukden Arsenal, and the Japanese will use it to produce a lot of small arms until 1945, when World War II ends. Now, at the end of World War II, the Soviets very briefly occupy this area, and then it's taken over by the Chinese Communists. So remember, between 45 and 49, we're in the end stages of the Chinese Civil War. What started as a whole bunch of warlords has kind of narrowed itself down to the Communist group and the Nationalist group. And the two are still fighting after World War II. The US is generally on the side of the Nationalists. Not enough for them to actually win. The Nationalists end up evacuating off to the island of Taiwan, and the conflict never really ended. Like, we still have China versus Taiwan, and that's the origin of that whole geopolitical thing. But the Communists take over this arsenal. They rename it first the 90th Arsenal, and then they rename it the Shenyang Dan Arsenal. And they continue production of small arms there. And one of the things that they start producing right at like 1949, right at the end of the Civil War, is a copy of the PPSh-41. They get very few of them done. They have a mixture of some Soviet plans, it's unclear exactly where they get them, and some reverse engineered stuff. But they're setting up to make these guns at Shenyang Dan. And then in 49, the Nationalists bomb the place. And it doesn't appear that it was like a really catastrophic bombing raid, but it makes the Chinese reconsider, it makes Mao reconsider whether it's a good idea to have a really huge manufacturing complex all in one nice, convenient, compact bombing target. And perhaps they should split up some of this industry. And so they stay in Manchuria, and they find three little podunk towns that are basically in the middle of nowhere, but are on the railway lines. And they decide one of them will be set up as the new artillery arsenal, one is the new ammunition production facility, and one is the new small arms arsenal. The town picked for small arms is the town of Bei'an, which I'm probably butchering the name of, I'm sorry. It will become such a significant center of arms manufacture that it colloquially gets the name Gun City in China. And like I said, it's named Factory 626. It's given the cover name of the Qinghua Tool Company. And it'll be making guns clear through to AKs, like those Norinco 626 AKs. Yeah, they're made in this city, the same production complex as these guys. Now, when they first set this up, what happens is late 49, early 50, they bring in tooling from the old Shenyang Dan arsenal to set up 4 different guns for production. One of them is the PPSh-41. One of them is the Type 38 Arisaka. Makes sense. The Japanese have been making them. They've got all the tooling and everything. One is the Type 24 Mauser, which was under Nationalists, it was known as the Chiang Kai Shek rifle. It's a Mauser 98. These were very popular with the warlord era armies. They continue production of that. And the fourth, interestingly, is the M1 Carbine. they set up to make a copy of the M1 Carbine, which does not work. Apparently they only make a couple hundred of them. Someday it would be awesome to find one of those couple hundred because the project was just canned. And in fact, as 1950 progresses, the factory manager of Factory 626 is getting ready to just shut down production of the Type 50, the PPShs, completely. He's looking at the production tooling that he has, the machines that he has, and thinks they don't really fit the workflow needed to manufacture the PPSh efficiently. These are all being artisanally made, you know, every gun's hand-fitted, hand-assembled, and that's not how this sort of thing really is supposed to work. So he's getting ready to shut it down when, in the background, MacArthur is landing troops at Incheon in Korea. The Korean War is going on here, and UN forces in Korea start making really good headway heading north through Korea up towards China. This gives Mao a significant emotional event, and he decides that, you know what, we're going to need submachine guns. Like a lot of submachine guns. And so in March of 1951, orders come down to the Factory 626 manager that he needs to start production of 7,500 to 9,000 PPShs per month. Yeah, the gun he was about to shut down because they couldn't really do them, now they need to make hundreds of them per day. And so he has his own significant emotional event, as you might imagine. There is essentially a mad rush to get the factory set up to focus on this, and they pull it off. By June of 51, the first major delivery is made. That's 2,628 of these, and production would scale up from there. And in total, these would be manufactured until December of 1953. So with that all being said, this is a copy of the PPSh-41, but it's not an exact copy. So let me show you some of the differences. All right, first thing to talk about is magazines. The Soviet PPSh-41 started off with a 71-round drum magazine, and then they transitioned to the use of 35-round box magazines. Now the problem was the drum magazines are noisy, they're time-consuming to load, they're heavy, they're awkward to carry. They offer a lot of ammunition, yes, but they had a lot of trouble during the war making these actually truly interchangeable between guns, and they never actually did. So if you had a PPSh, what you would have to do is find a couple of magazines that worked in your particular gun and make sure to keep them. Now, later in the war, they decide enough of this nonsense, we can just, you know, two of these are a lot lighter than just the drum magazine. They're easier to carry, they're more reliable, they can be made totally interchangeable. This is the better thing. And the Chinese essentially follow the exact same path. So there was a US ordnance report that came out during the Korean War that said that these guys could not use drum magazines, and that was a mistake. Like, that was in error, and yet it stuck and has remained common knowledge, to the extent that there is common knowledge about the Type 50, ever since. The reality is Type 50s will in fact use Soviet, there we go, 71-round drum magazines. And in fact, the Chinese at 626 manufactured these drums, but only until about 1952, when they realized exactly the same things that the Russians had realized, that they're not that efficient, they're hard, they weren't able to make them interchangeable either, and so the Chinese abandoned the drums and reverted to just box mags. And this is what you see almost always in Chinese PPShs. So 35 rounds, double stack, single feed. They're all totally interchangeable with the Russian mags. Controls on the Type 50 are super simple. We got our magazine release here. Originally, the idea was a drum magazine would last you a long time, and you didn't want to accidentally bump the release and drop the drum, so they made the magazine release fold, so that when you had the drum in place, you could fold it up, and then you couldn't accidentally release it. The Chinese copied that. We do have a semi-auto selector here, so forward is full auto, and rearward, like that, is semi-auto. The safety is this sort of knurled bit on top of the bolt. Notice that there are two little notches in the receiver here, and what you can do is push that into the notch. That locks the bolt in place, either forward or cocked at the rear. So that's your safety. It does fire from an open bolt. Rate of fire is very high, 900 rounds a minute or a little bit more. Now the sights are the most significant difference between the Chinese Type 50 and the Russian PPSh, and that's because they're actually aperture sights. You have a two-position flip aperture one larger close range and one smaller long range aperture there. The front sight is the same as the Soviet, it's just a little post. For reference sake, here's a Soviet PPSh with a rear notch sight instead of an aperture. And then interestingly, the Chinese positioned the rear sight just a little bit farther forward than the Russians did. And this is actually a way that you can visually distinguish these two guns in pictures, because there aren't really any other easily distinguishable differences. This distance versus this distance, you can usually notice in photos. So there's that. The front sights are also slightly different. The Chinese front sight is a little bit farther forward, just like the rear, than the Soviet. So this is Soviet, and you can see we've got this much space between the front sight and the front muzzle brake port. On the Chinese, we have much less space there. Don't pay attention to the difference in style of the front sight hoods, because there are a couple different variations of Russian front sight hoods. Some Russian guns also have this additional little flange, sort of reinforcing over the magazine well. The Chinese ones did not have that. And from there we get into a couple really nitpicky little changes, like the sling bar on the rear is located a little bit lower in the stock on the Chinese than it was on the Russian one. Like, now we're getting pretty nerdy there. For what it's worth, early on in production, 626 did use some two-part stocks, split kind of like Arisaka stocks, which makes sense because they had also been manufacturing Arisakas. But they didn't apparently work all that well in submachine guns, and so that practice was abandoned fairly quickly, and most of those original stocks were eventually replaced. Here are our receiver markings, by the way. This is 50 type 50, factory 626, production date on this is 1952, and our serial number is 83,833. And that serial number is repeated a couple other places, or at least the last couple digits of it are. Disassembly is just like a Soviet gun. Push the end cap back, lift this up, and we can then pull. We can pull the bolt assembly out. The Soviet guns have a fiber buffer at the back. The Chinese ones had a rubber. This one is clearly the original rubber because it is hard as a rock. So someone who gets this, if they decide to shoot it, they should definitely replace this before they actually go shoot it, because I suspect the first time you fire this, this thing is going to just evaporate into powder. But the rest of this, you can see we have our serial number there. Recoil spring, little tiny thing. Bolt. That's it. That's all there is to it. That is a PPSh. That's why it was so easy to manufacture. Simple dropping sear there. Does, though, have a semi-auto selector switch on it. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but the Chinese Type 50s are actually usually, like on the whole, they're better made guns than the Soviet PPSh-41s. The Soviet guns were being made under a lot of duress most of the time during a war. The Chinese ones, well, yes, the Korean War was going on, but it wasn't quite such an urgent struggle for guns as the Soviets had during World War II. So these are nicely made guns. If they were more common, I think there would be more of a recognition that they are a better execution of the design than the Soviets did. The PPSh-41 was not the final Soviet submachine gun of World War II. They, after development of this, a couple of years later, they would roll out the Sudaev PPSh-43, which was an even more economical gun to manufacture. And the Chinese followed the exact same path. So as they were manufacturing these guns, they were also working on setting up production of their own copy of the PPSh, or the PPS, the Sudaev 43. That would become known as the Type 54 submachine gun, and they arranged to have basically a smooth transition at Factory 626 from manufacturing these to manufacturing copies of the PPS-43, because it was more efficient and cheaper to make. So that takes place right at the beginning of 1954. They switch over to the new gun. There's a grand total of 358,000 of these Type 50s manufactured at Factory 626. Now there are two other factories that manufactured them, but 626 is the predominant factory. This was where most of them were made. And I think it's really cool to actually have some of the backstory. So many of the Chinese firearms from this period, we just don't know that much about in the West. And I think it really brings some additional light to to know where they came from and under specifically what circumstances. So once again, a big thanks to the author of World War II Before World War II. Check that link out in the description text below. And of course, thanks to Morphy's for having this one. This is, by the standard, I mean, this is in pretty good shape. By the standards of Chinese military firearms here in the US, this is in fantastic shape. Most of the time, Chinese stuff that we have on the registry is in really poor condition. Not this one. This one's in great shape. So very cool to get a chance to take a look at that. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.